The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt as Marcus Rivera stepped out of his beat-up Ford pickup truck. The heat shimmered in waves across the parking lot of Phoenix General Hospital, creating an almost hypnotic dance that reminded him too much of another desert thousands of miles away. He paused, gripping the door handle until his knuckles went white, forcing himself to breathe through the familiar tightness in his chest. "You're not there anymore," he whispered to himself, a ritual that had become as routine as brushing his teeth. "You're home." But home felt like a foreign country these days. Marcus grabbed his paramedic bag from the passenger seat and slung it over his shoulder. The weight of it was comforting, different from the medic kit he'd carried through the mountains of Afghanistan, but the purpose remained the same: save lives, patch people up, keep moving forward. The automatic doors of the hospital whooshed open, and the familiar smell of antiseptic and coffee hit him. It was better than the smell of dust and diesel fuel that still haunted his dreams. Dr. Sarah Chen looked up from the nurse's station as he approached, her tired smile a welcome sight. "Morning, Marcus. Rough night?" He could see the concern in her eyes. Sarah had been asking that question more frequently over the past few months, ever since she'd found him sitting in his truck in the parking lot at 3 a.m., staring at nothing. "Same as always, Doc. Ready for whatever the day brings." Sarah studied his face for a moment longer than necessary. As the head of emergency medicine, she'd seen plenty of trauma cases walk through those doors, but she recognized the particular kind of damage that came from combat. Marcus wore it in the way he constantly scanned rooms when he entered, the way he positioned himself near exits, the way his jaw tensed when helicopters flew overhead. "We've got a multi-vehicle accident coming in about 10 minutes, she said, handing him a cup of black coffee. 3 casualties, you up for it?" Marcus nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. This was what he lived for now, the moments when his training kicked in and the ghosts receded. When his hands moved with practiced precision and his mind focused on what needed to be done rather than what had already been done. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, not with anxiety, but with purpose. He drained his coffee cup and headed toward the trauma bay, his stride confident and sure. "Let's do this," he murmured, and for a moment, the weight on his chest lifted. Outside, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the landscape scarred and beautiful in its harshness. It looked nothing like Afghanistan, yet everything like it. Marcus Rivera was learning that some distances couldn't be measured in miles, and some journeys home took longer than others. The ambulance doors burst open, and the controlled chaos of saving lives began once again. The trauma bay erupted into organized chaos as the first stretcher rolled through the doors. Her teenage girl unconscious, blood matting her dark hair against the stark white of the trauma board. Marcus's hands moved automatically, checking vitals, starting an IV, his voice calm and steady as he called out readings to Dr. Chen. "Systolic pressure dropping, possible internal bleeding," he reported, his fingers finding the pulse point on her wrist. "Strong but rapid. She's fighting. Good. Let's keep it that way." Sarah's hands worked with surgical precision, checking pupil response while Marcus stabilized the IV line. "What's the story on the other 2? The second ambulance team wheeled in an elderly man, conscious but disoriented, a deep gash across his forehead. The third victim, a middle-aged woman, was already sitting up on her stretcher, more shaken than hurt, clutching a cell phone and trying to call her family. Marcus moved between the patients with fluid efficiency, a part of him marveling at how natural this felt. In the ER, he had a role, a purpose that made sense. There were protocols to follow, lives to save, clear objectives with measurable outcomes. It was nothing like the gray areas that had defined his final months in Afghanistan. "Marcus," Dr. Chen's voice cut through his thoughts, "can you assist with the sutures on bed 3? I need to get the girl up to surgery." He nodded, washing his hands methodically before approaching the elderly man. The patient's eyes were clearer now, tracking Marcus's movements as he prepared the suture kit. "You were in the service," the man said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Marcus's hands stilled for just a fraction of a second. "Yes, sir, Army." "I could tell. My boy was Army too." The man's voice carried a weight that Marcus recognized. 2 tours in Iraq. He didn't make it home. The trauma bay seemed to fade around them. Marcus met the older man's eyes, seeing his own reflection there. The particular grief that belonged to those who understood the cost of service. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus said quietly, beginning the first suture. His hands were steady, but something shifted inside his chest. What was his name? Tommy. Thomas Michael Brennan. He was a good kid, wanted to be a teacher when he got out. The man's voice cracked slightly. He was 23. Marcus continued working, each suture precise and careful. He sounds like someone worth remembering. He was. Mr. Brennan was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus's face. You got that look too, son. The one that says you've seen things. You doing okay? The question hit Marcus harder than he expected. When was the last time someone had asked him that and actually waited for an answer? Doctor. Chen checked on him professionally. His mother called from Tucson and worried from a distance, but nobody really asked. Nobody who understood. Some days are better than others, Marcus admitted, tying off the final suture. Mr. Brennan nodded knowingly. That's honest. Tommy used to say the same thing in his letters. Said the hardest part wasn't being over there. It was figuring out how to be back here. Marcus began cleaning up the suture tray, his movements mechanical, while his mind processed the old man's words. Through the trauma bay windows, he could see the sun climbing higher in the Arizona sky, the heat already building toward another scorching afternoon. You saved my life today, Mr. Brennan said as Marcus finished bandaging the wound. You and that doctor. I want you to know that means something. Marcus met his eyes again, seeing something he rarely allowed himself to recognize. Gratitude without complication, purpose without politics, a life saved that stayed saved. Just doing my job, sir. No, Mr. Brennan said firmly. You're doing what you're called to do. There's a difference. As Marcus left the trauma bay, those words echoed in his mind. The afternoon shift was just beginning, and Phoenix stretched out before him like an endless expanse of possibility and heat. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed overhead, and for once Marcus didn't flinch. Maybe Mr. Brennan was right. Maybe there was a difference between doing a job and answering a calling. Maybe figuring out that difference was the first step toward finding his way home. The VA hospital in downtown Phoenix felt different from the general hospital where Marcus worked. The walls here seemed to hold more secrets, more pain that couldn't be stitched up or medicated away. He sat in the waiting room, his appointment card crumpled in his sweaty palm, watching other veterans navigate their own private battles. Across from him, a woman about his age stared at a magazine without reading it, her left leg bouncing in a nervous rhythm. Her army tattoo peeked out from beneath her sleeve, a desert tan that matched his own. To his right, an older man with Vietnam-era ribbons on his jacket cap dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes as if responding to some distant sound. Marcus Rivera. The voice belonged to Dr. Amanda Foster, a clinical psychologist who looked younger than she probably was, with kind eyes that had seen too much and still managed to offer hope. Marcus followed her down a hallway, lined with motivational posters that felt hollow and well-meaning at the same time. Her office was small but comfortable, with a view of the desert mountains that reminded him why he'd chosen to stay in Arizona after his discharge. "How are things at the hospital?" Dr. Foster asked as they settled into their usual chairs. They'd been meeting monthly for the past year, a condition Marcus had agreed to when he'd started having the nightmares again. Good, busy, same as always. He knew she was looking for more, but giving details felt like opening a door he preferred to keep locked. "Tell me about your week. Any triggers? Difficult moments?" Marcus thought about Mr. Brennan, about the weight of those words. You're doing what you're called to do. He thought about the helicopter that had passed overhead, how he'd managed not to flinch. Small victories. Had an interesting conversation with a patient. His son died in Iraq. It got me thinking. About what? This was the hard part. The reason these sessions felt like walking through a minefield. Every question led toward the same destination, that day in the Korengal Valley when everything changed. The day Sergeant Martinez had shoved a rifle into his hands and said, "Doc, we need you to take the shot." About purpose, I guess, about whether what I'm doing now means anything. Dr. Foster leaned forward slightly. "What do you think? Does it mean something?" Marcus stared out the window at the mountains. They looked nothing like the Hindu Kush, but mountains were mountains, and they all cast long shadows. "I used to know," he said quietly. "When I was over there, everything was clear. Save the wounded, patch them up, get them back to fighting, or get them home. Simple. And now? Now I save people in car accidents and drug overdoses and domestic violence calls, and I go home to an empty apartment and wonder if any of it matters, if I'm just existing." The silence stretched between them. Dr. Foster had learned not to rush him during these moments. Marcus was processing, working through thoughts he rarely allowed himself to examine in the harsh light of day. You mentioned that day in Afghanistan again in our last session, the day you had to step outside your role as a medic. Marcus's jaw tightened. I don't want to talk about that. I know, but it's still affecting you. The guilt you carry about that moment. I took an oath. Marcus cut her off. First, do no harm. I became a medic because I wanted to save lives, not take them. You did save lives that day. Your entire unit, by becoming something I never wanted to be. The words came out harsher than he intended. You want to know about triggers, Doc? Every time I hear a rifle crack at the range, every time I see a sniper scope in a movie, every time someone calls me a hero, that's a trigger. Because heroes don't have to choose between their principles and their brothers. Dr. Foster nodded, making a note in her file. But you did choose. In an impossible situation, you made a choice that kept your unit alive. That's not something to be ashamed of. Marcus stood up abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the Phoenix heat was building toward another brutal afternoon. Somewhere out there, people were living their lives, unaware that men and women like him carried invisible wounds that never quite healed. Time's up, he said, though he knew they still had 20 minutes left. Dr. Foster didn't argue. Same time next month? Marcus nodded without turning around. As he left the VA hospital, the Arizona sun felt like a weight on his shoulders, pressing down on memories he couldn't quite bury and couldn't quite face. The emergency department at Phoenix General took on a different personality after midnight. The harsh fluorescent light seemed dimmer, the pace more urgent and unpredictable. Marcus preferred the night shifts, fewer administrators, less bureaucracy, just the pure essence of emergency medicine stripped down to its most essential elements. He was restocking trauma bay supplies when his radio crackled to life. Unit 47, we've got a domestic violence call, one victim en route, ETA 5 minutes. Female, mid-20s, multiple contusions, and possible broken ribs. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Domestic violence calls were among the hardest, not because of the medical complexity, but because of the helplessness that followed. You could heal the physical wounds, but the deeper damage often remained invisible and untreated. The ambulance arrived with sirens wailing. The paramedics wheeled in a young woman who looked even younger than her reported age, her face swollen and bruised, her eyes holding that particular emptiness that came from betrayal by someone who was supposed to love and protect. Her name is Elena, reported Jake Martinez, the lead paramedic and one of the few people at the hospital who knew about Marcus's military service. Boyfriend did this. She's scared to press charges. Doctor. Chen took point on the medical assessment, while Marcus handled the technical support. X-rays, IV fluids, pain management. But he found himself watching Elena's eyes, recognizing something familiar in her expression. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror for months after coming home. The look of someone who had survived something they never thought they'd have to survive. I should go back, Elena whispered, as Dr. Chen examined her ribs. He doesn't mean it. He's just stressed about work. Marcus had heard variations of those words dozens of times. The justifications, the rationalizations, the desperate need to believe that love could coexist with violence. But tonight, something about Elena's voice reminded him of his sister Carmen, who had married young and stayed silent about her husband's temper until it was almost too late. Elena, he said gently, pulling a chair beside her bed. I'm Marcus. I'm going to stay with you while Dr. Chen gets your X-ray results, okay? She nodded, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting her boyfriend to appear at any moment. Can I tell you something? Marcus kept his voice low, conversational. I have a sister who went through something similar. She used to say the same things you're saying right now, that it wasn't his fault, that she could fix him, that she deserved it somehow. Elena's eyes focused on him for the first time. What happened to her? She almost died, Marcus said simply. One night he went too far. If the neighbors hadn't called the police, he left the sentence hanging, letting Elena fill in the implications. But you're here talking to me like everything's okay, so she must be fine now, right? Marcus smiled sadly. She's alive. She's safe. But it took years of therapy and a lot of support to get there. And you know what she told me last year? She said the hardest part wasn't leaving him. It was learning to trust herself again, learning that she deserved better. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face. You were in the army. It wasn't a question. People who had experienced trauma seemed to recognize it in others, like members of a club nobody wanted to join. Yes, Afghanistan. 3 tours. Did you have to hurt people? The question hit him like a physical blow. Most people asked if he'd killed anyone, usually with a mixture of morbid curiosity and discomfort. But Elena's question was different, more precise, more understanding of the grey areas that existed in a world where survival sometimes required compromising your principles. Yes, he said quietly, I did things I never thought I'd have to do. Things that went against everything I believed about myself. How do you live with that? Marcus glanced around the trauma bay at the controlled chaos of the night shift, at Dr. Chen reviewing x-rays with focused intensity, at Jake Martinez restocking the ambulance for the next call. I try to balance it out, he said finally. Every life I save here, every person I help, it doesn't erase what I did, but it adds weight to the other side of the scale. And I'm learning that maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about accepting that good people sometimes do terrible things in terrible situations, and that doesn't make them terrible people. Elena reached out tentatively and touched his hand. Her fingers were cold but steady. Do you think I'm weak for staying with him this long? I think you're strong for surviving this long, Marcus replied, and I think you're brave enough to survive whatever comes next, whether that's leaving or getting help or finding a different way forward. Dr. Chen approached with the x-ray results, 2 cracked ribs, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and proper care. As they prepared Elena's discharge paperwork, she squeezed Marcus's hand one more time. Thank you for not lying to me, she said, for not pretending it would be easy. As Marcus watched her leave with a domestic violence advocate and a safety plan, he realized that Dr. Foster had been right about something. The day in Afghanistan when he'd had to abandon his medic's oath and pick up a rifle, maybe that hadn't been the end of who he was. Maybe it had been the beginning of who he was becoming. The night shift continued around him, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The Phoenix Veterans Community Center occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, its metal walls baking in the relentless Arizona sun. Marcus hadn't wanted to come, but Jake Martinez had been persistent, showing up at his apartment with coffee and the kind of stubborn determination that made him an excellent paramedic. Just one meeting, man, Jake had said, leaning against Marcus's doorframe. These guys get it. They've all been where you are. Now Marcus sat in a circle of folding chairs, surrounded by men and women whose faces told stories similar to his own. The group leader was a former Marine named David Torres, who had lost his left leg to an IED in Fallujah, and somehow managed to radiate more peace than most people Marcus knew with all their limbs intact. We've got a new face tonight, David said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who had led men in combat and learned to lead them in healing. Marcus, you want to tell us a little about yourself? Marcus cleared his throat, acutely aware of 12 pairs of eyes focused on him. Marcus Rivera, Army medic, 3 tours in Afghanistan. I work at Phoenix General now. How long you been back? Asked a woman across the circle. Her name tag read, Sarah, Army MP. She looked about 40, with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much but still held kindness. 2 years, 3 months, 16 days. The precision of his answer surprised even him. A few knowing nods around the circle. They understood that kind of counting, the way homecoming became a measurement of survival rather than celebration. What brought you here tonight? David asked gently. Marcus glanced at Jake, who offered an encouraging smile. I guess I'm tired of feeling like I'm stuck, like I can't move forward. What's keeping you stuck? This from a young guy who couldn't be older than 25, with navy tattoos covering his forearms. The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus found himself staring at his hands, calloused from years of medical work, steady enough to start IVs in moving ambulances, but still trembling sometimes when he woke from nightmares. I did something over there, he said quietly. Something that goes against everything I believed about myself, and I can't figure out how to live with it. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of recognition, of people who understood that some wounds couldn't be seen on x-rays. You want to talk about it? David's voice held no judgment, only invitation. Marcus looked around the circle again. These weren't civilians who would thank him for his service and then change the subject. These were people who knew that service came with a price that couldn't be calculated in paychecks or benefits. "We were in the Korangal Valley," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "My unit was pinned down by sniper fire. 3 of my guys were wounded, bleeding out in the open where I couldn't reach them. The sniper had us locked down from a ridgeline about 800 meters out. The room seemed to contract around him, the Arizona heat giving way to the thin air of Afghan mountains. Our designated marksman was down, unconscious from shrapnel, and Sergeant Martinez." Marcus paused, remembering the weight of the rifle being pressed into his hands. He said, "Doc, you're the best shot we've got left. You take him out or we all die here." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "What did you do?" "I took the shot." The words came out flat, emotionless. 837 meters. 1 shot center mass. He went down and we got our wounded out. The young Navy veteran whistled low. "Hell of a shot, Doc." But Marcus was shaking his head. "You don't understand. I took an oath. First, do no harm. I became a medic because I wanted to save lives, not end them. And in that moment, I became everything I never wanted to be." David studied him for a long moment. "How many lives did you save that day?" "What? You're wounded. How many made it out because of what you did?" Marcus felt tears burning behind his eyes. "All of them. Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, all 3 made it home. And your unit? 12 men walked off that mountain. If I hadn't taken the shot, if you hadn't taken the shot, how many would have walked off?" Marcus couldn't answer. The mathematics of survival were too brutal, too simple. An older man with Vietnam ribbons on his jacket spoke for the first time. "Son, I spent 40 years hating myself for the things I did in the jungle. 40 years thinking I was damned. You know what I learned? Sometimes being good means making terrible choices. Sometimes saving lives means taking one." "But the oath..." "The oath says do no harm," Sarah interrupted. "You prevented harm that day. You prevented the harm that would have come to your brothers, to their families, to everyone who loved them and needed them to come home." Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, a pressure that had been building for 2 years finally finding release. "The guys in my unit," he whispered, "they called me a hero. They said they'd never forget what I did. But I can't see it that way." "Maybe that's okay," David said. "Maybe heroes don't get to see themselves as heroes. Maybe that's what makes them heroes in the first place." The session continued for another hour, but Marcus barely heard the other stories. He was lost in memory, replaying that moment on the ridgeline when Sergeant Martinez had looked him in the eyes and said, "I trust you, Doc. We all do." As the meeting broke up, Sarah approached him. "You coming back next week?" Marcus nodded, surprising himself. "Yeah, I think I am." Walking out into the Phoenix evening, Jake fell into step beside him. "How do you feel?" Marcus looked up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear above the city lights. "Different," he said finally. "Not better exactly, but different." "Different's a start, hermano." Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks. "Yeah, it is." 3 weeks later, Marcus was beginning to find a rhythm. The support group meetings had become an anchor point in his week, and the nightmares, while not gone, had become less frequent. He was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, he could build something resembling a normal life. That illusion shattered at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, when his phone rang with the harsh urgency of an emergency call. "Marcus, we need you here now." Dr. Chen's voice carried a tension he'd rarely heard from her. "Active shooter situation at Desert Ridge High School, multiple casualties incoming, and we're getting reports of at least 1 officer down." Marcus was already reaching for his clothes, his body moving with the automatic responses of someone trained to react to crisis. "How many?" "Unknown. First responders are still securing the scene, but Marcus..." She paused, and in that pause, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "The shooter is reportedly using a high-powered rifle. The wounds we're going to see..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Marcus had seen what high-powered rifles could do to human bodies, had seen it in Afghanistan, had caused it himself on that ridgeline in the Korangal Valley. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of red lights and sirens. Phoenix at night looked different through the windshield of an emergency response, the familiar streets becoming a maze of potential routes and obstacles, every intersection a calculation of time versus safety. The hospital was already transforming when he arrived. The normal calm of the night shift had been replaced by controlled urgency as staff prepared for mass casualties. Dr. Chen met him at the entrance, her face grim. "What do we know?" Marcus asked, falling into step beside her. 17-year-old male, opened fire during a late-night basketball practice. We've got 6 wounded, 2 critical. And Marcus..." She stopped walking, forcing him to face her. "One of the wounded is a police sniper. Officer Danny Morrison, Phoenix PD SWAT. 28 years old, married, 2 kids. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was different. This time the anxiety mixed with something else, a strange sense of purpose, of pieces falling into place. What's his condition? Took a round to the chest, just missed his heart. He's stable but critical. The thing is, Dr. Chen hesitated. He's asking for you specifically. For me? How does he even know me? Apparently, Jake Martinez told the responding paramedics that we had a former Army medic with combat experience. Morrison heard it over the radio. He specifically requested that you be part of his care team. The first ambulance arrived before Marcus could process what that meant. The paramedics wheeled in a teenage girl, her leg badly damaged by high-velocity rounds. Marcus fell into the familiar rhythm of trauma care, his hands moving with practiced precision, while his mind remained crystal clear and focused. But it was when they brought in Officer Morrison that everything changed. The wounded police sniper looked younger than his 28 years, his face pale but alert. When he saw Marcus, his eyes focused with desperate intensity. "You're the medic," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who made the shot in Afghanistan." Marcus felt the world narrow around them. "How do you—" "Jake told us. 800 meters Korangal Valley, 1 shot." Morrison's eyes never left Marcus's face. "I need you to know something, Doc. Tonight I couldn't make my shot. The angle was wrong. The backstop was compromised. Kids were in the way. I had the shooter in my scope 3 different times and I couldn't pull the trigger." Doctor Chen was working to stabilize Morrison's chest wound, but Marcus could see that the officer's attention was focused entirely on him. "That's good," Marcus said, checking Morrison's IV line. "That means you did your job right. You protected innocent people." "No, you don't understand." Morrison grabbed Marcus's wrist with surprising strength. "The shooter got away. He's still out there. They lost him in the desert behind the school, and when they find him..." Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "When they find him, I don't know if I'll be able to do what needs to be done, not after tonight." Marcus understood then why Morrison had asked for him specifically. It wasn't just about medical care, it was about recognition. One shooter recognizing another. One man who had been forced to take a life reaching out to another who might soon face the same choice. "Listen to me," Marcus said, leaning close so only Morrison could hear. "Whatever happens when they find him, you'll make the right call. You'll know what to do when the moment comes." "How can you be sure?" Marcus thought about the support group, about David Torres's words, about the weight of survival and the mathematics of choice. Because you care about whether it's right or wrong because it matters to you. That's what makes the difference. As they wheeled Morrison into surgery, Marcus stood in the trauma bay, surrounded by the controlled chaos of emergency medicine. Outside, Phoenix PD helicopters circled the desert, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like mechanical predators hunting for a wounded animal. His radio crackled. "All units, suspect still at large, armed and dangerous. Use extreme caution." Marcus looked at his hands, steady, skilled, trained to save lives. But trained for other things too when saving lives required it. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, Marcus Rivera wondered if his war was really over. The manhunt stretched into its 2nd day, and Phoenix felt like a city holding its breath. Marcus had barely left the hospital, catching fragments of sleep in the on-call room between treating the ongoing stream of victims' families and the officers working the case. The shooter, identified as Kevin Walsh, a 17-year-old with a history of bullying and social isolation, remained at large somewhere in the Sonoran Desert. Marcus was reviewing patient charts when Detective Lisa Santos approached him. He recognized her from the support group. She'd been there twice, sitting quietly in the back, never speaking but always listening with the intense focus of someone gathering intelligence. "Marcus, right. From the group?" He nodded, setting down his clipboard. "Detective Santos. How's Officer Morrison?" "Stable. Surgery went well. He's asking for you again." She paused, studying his face with the careful attention of someone trained to read people. "Actually, that's why I'm here. We need to talk." They found a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, empty except for a few exhausted night shift workers. Detective Santos spread a map of the desert area on the table, marked with red X's indicating search zones. We've got over 200 officers out there, including aerial units, K9 teams, and thermal imaging. Nothing. It's like the kid just vanished. She traced a finger along the perimeter of the search area. The thing is, we know he's still armed. The rifle he used at the school, it's his grandfather's old hunting rifle, 30-06, with a decent scope. And according to his internet history, he's been researching guerrilla warfare tactics. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. You think he's planning another attack? I think he's a scared kid with a powerful weapon, possibly injured, definitely desperate. The worst possible combination. Detective Santos met his eyes. I also think you might be the only person in this city who understands how he's thinking right now. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. You want me to help track him. I want you to help us understand him. You know that terrain? Desert warfare, improvised positions, how someone with limited resources might survive out there while staying hidden. Marcus shook his head. I'm a medic, a paramedic. I save lives. I don't hunt people. Don't you? Detective Santos's voice was gentle but direct. What did you do in the Korengal Valley, Marcus, when your unit was pinned down and people were dying? The question hung between them like a challenge. Marcus could hear the helicopters outside, their rotors beating against the morning air with mechanical persistence. Somewhere out there, a 17-year-old boy was hiding with a rifle, and every hour he remained free increased the chances of more violence. Even if I wanted to help, Marcus said quietly, I'm not law enforcement. I can't just join your search. Actually, you can. Detective Santos pulled out a folder. Phoenix PD has a consultant program for specialists with unique skill sets. Combat veterans, former federal agents, people with expertise we don't have in-house. It's all legal, all voluntary. Marcus stared at the paperwork. The decision felt enormous, weighted with implications he couldn't fully process. Going back to that world, even as a consultant, felt like admitting that he could never truly leave the war behind. What exactly would you need me to do? Come with me to the command post. Look at what we know about his movements, his likely hiding spots. Help us think like someone who's been trained in survival and concealment. Detective Santos folded the map carefully. And if we do locate him, we need someone who understands what it means to make a difficult shot in a difficult situation. The weight of it settled on Marcus's shoulders like familiar gear. I need to think about it. Of course. But Marcus, Detective Santos stood to leave. We found something else in the kid's bedroom, a journal. He wrote about wanting to go out like a warrior, about making people remember his name. This isn't over. He's planning something bigger. After she left, Marcus sat alone in the cafeteria, staring at the consultant paperwork. Through the windows he could see the desert stretching toward the mountains, vast and unforgiving under the morning sun. Somewhere out there, a frightened teenager with a rifle was making choices that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. Marcus thought about Officer Morrison, about the weight of having someone in your scope and knowing that pulling the trigger would change everything. He thought about his unit in Afghanistan, about Rodriguez and Chen and Williams, all alive today because he had made an impossible choice in an impossible moment. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake Martinez. Heard they asked you to consult. Whatever you decide, I got your back, hermano. Marcus picked up his pen and signed the paperwork. The Phoenix PD command post occupied a parking lot at the base of South Mountain, a maze of mobile units, communication equipment and tactical vehicles that transformed the peaceful desert landscape into something that looked disturbingly familiar to Marcus. He stood at the edge of the operation, wearing a consultant badge and feeling like he was stepping back into a world he'd tried to leave behind. Detective Santos introduced him to Commander Patricia Webb, a 20-year veteran of SWAT operations whose reputation for level-headed decision-making had made her the natural choice to lead the manhunt. She studied Marcus with the appraising look of someone evaluating a new piece of equipment. Rivera, I've heard about your military record. Afghanistan, 3 tours. Expert marksman rating. She gestured toward a table covered with maps and photographs. Tell me what you see. Marcus studied the materials spread before him. Aerial photographs of the search area, topographical maps marked with red zones, photographs of Kevin Walsh's bedroom, showing detailed sketches of sniper positions and escape routes. "He's been planning this for months," Marcus said, tracing patterns in the drawings. "Look at these diagrams. He's studied overwatch positions, calculated fields of fire, identified blind spots in the terrain." He looked up at Commander Webb. "This isn't a panicked kid running randomly through the desert. He knows exactly where he's going." Detective Santos pointed to a satellite image. "We found his grandfather's truck abandoned here, about 2 miles from the school. Blood on the driver's seat, but not enough to suggest a serious wound." Marcus examined the location, then cross-referenced it with the topographical map. "He's moving toward higher elevation. See this ridgeline? It offers multiple escape routes, clear sightlines back toward the city, and caves for shelter." He paused, remembering similar terrain analysis from his military days. "If I were him, this is where I'd go." Commander Webb studied the area Marcus had identified. "That's outside our primary search zone. We've been focusing on lower elevations, thinking he'd want easier terrain." "He's not thinking like a normal person anymore," Marcus said quietly. "He's thinking like someone who expects to die, but wants to choose how it happens. High ground gives him control, makes him the predator instead of the prey." A radio crackled to life. "Command, this is Air Unit 7. We've got movement on the southeast ridge, approximately 2 clicks from the abandoned vehicle location." Marcus felt his pulse spike. "That's it. That's where he is." Commander Webb was already coordinating response teams. "Ground units, converge on Sector 7 Alpha, maintain safe distance and establish perimeter. No one moves in until we have a clear picture." As the tactical units mobilized, Marcus found himself swept up in the familiar rhythm of military operations. Radio chatter, map coordinates, risk assessments. It all came flooding back with disturbing clarity. Detective Santos appeared at his elbow. "How are you holding up?" Marcus realized his hands were shaking slightly. "It's like riding a bike. You never really forget." "Is that good or bad?" Before Marcus could answer, another radio transmission cut through the noise. "Command, we have visual confirmation. One male subject appears to be armed with a long rifle. He's in an elevated position with clear fields of fire toward the access road." Commander Webb turned to Marcus. "Now you know what this means. If we can't talk him down." Marcus nodded grimly. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Kevin Walsh had positioned himself in a location where he could inflict maximum casualties on anyone who approached. Standard SWAT tactics would put officers at unacceptable risk. "I need to see the position," Marcus said. "Direct visual, not just aerial photos." 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself lying prone behind a rocky outcropping, studying the ridge through high-powered binoculars. 800 meters away, Kevin Walsh had created an improvised sniper's nest using rocks and desert vegetation. The position was well chosen, professionally executed, and nearly impossible to approach without being seen. "Jesus," whispered the SWAT sniper beside him. "Kid knows what he's doing." Marcus adjusted the focus on his binoculars, studying the 17-year-old boy who had become the center of a citywide manhunt. Even at this distance, he could see the tension in Kevin's posture, the way he constantly scanned his surroundings, the careful attention to his weapon. "He's scared," Marcus said quietly. "Look at his body language. He's not some cold-blooded killer. He's a terrified kid who's painted himself into a corner." "Scared kids with rifles are still dangerous," the SWAT sniper replied. "Maybe more dangerous." Marcus lowered his binoculars and studied the terrain between their position and Kevin's nest. The approach would be treacherous. Open ground for the first 500 meters, then a steep climb over loose rock that would be impossible to navigate quietly. "What's the plan?" he asked. Commander Webb's voice crackled through their radio headsets. "Negotiation team is trying to establish communication. If that fails..." She left the implications unspoken. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decisions settling on him like the desert heat. Somewhere behind them, Phoenix continued its daily rhythm, unaware that the outcome of the next few hours might depend on choices made by men with rifles in the unforgiving landscape of the Sonoran Desert. When he opened his eyes, Kevin Walsh was still there, 800 meters away, holding a rifle and waiting for whatever came next. Marcus had been here before, in different mountains with different stakes, but the same impossible mathematics of survival. The only question now was whether he was ready to be that person again. The negotiation had been going on for 3 hours, and Kevin Walsh wasn't responding to any attempts at communication. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky, turning the rocky landscape into a furnace that made every movement an effort. Marcus lay motionless behind his observation point, watching the 17-year-old through his binoculars, studying every detail of the boy's behavior. "He's dehydrating," Marcus reported through his radio. "Look at his movements. They're getting sluggish, less coordinated. He's been out here for 2 days with limited water." Commander Webb's voice crackled back. "Does that make him more or less dangerous?" "Both," Marcus replied grimly. "He's physically weakening, but desperate people make unpredictable choices, and he's still got that rifle." As if summoned by Marcus's words, Kevin suddenly stood up in his position, rifle in hand, and fired 3 shots into the air, a clear message that he was still armed and still in control of his situation. The sound echoed off the desert rocks like thunder, and Marcus felt his combat instinct surge to life. "All units hold position," Commander Webb ordered immediately. "Do not return fire unless you have a clear threat to civilian life." But even as she spoke, Marcus could see movement in the valley below Kevin's position. A family of hikers, 2 adults and 2 small children, had apparently been caught in the desert when the search began, and were now trying to make their way back to the trailhead. They were directly in Kevin's line of sight, less than 400 meters from his position. "Command, we have civilians in the target zone," Marcus reported, his voice tight with urgency. "Family with children, moving toward the access road." Through his binoculars, Marcus watched Kevin notice the family. The boy's posture changed, becoming more alert, more focused. He raised his rifle, not aiming yet, but clearly tracking their movement through his scope. "Jesus Christ," whispered the SWAT sniper beside Marcus. "He's got them lined up." Marcus's radio exploded with chatter as units tried to coordinate a response, but the mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. The family was too far from cover, too exposed on the open trail. Any attempt to reach them would put officers in Kevin's crosshairs, and there was no guarantee they could get there before the boy decided to fire. "Rivera," Commander Webb's voice cut through the radio noise. "You have the clearest sight line to the target. What's your assessment?" Marcus adjusted his binoculars, studying Kevin through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. The boy's finger was on the trigger guard, his breathing visible even at this distance as his chest rose and fell with nervous energy. "He's making a decision," Marcus said quietly. "I can see it in his body language. He's about to do something. Can you take the shot?" The question hung in the desert air like a physical weight. Marcus looked at the rifle lying beside him, a Phoenix PD sniper weapon that the SWAT team had provided, familiar in weight and feel despite being a different model than what he'd used in Afghanistan. 812 meters to target, slight crosswind from the northeast, temperature approximately 105 degrees. All factors he could calculate, all variables he could account for, except one. "It's a 17-year-old kid," Marcus said into his radio. "It's a 17-year-old kid with a rifle pointed at a family," Commander Webb replied. "Marcus, I need to know, can you make this shot?" Marcus closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back on that ridgeline in the Korengal Valley, with Sergeant Martinez pressing a rifle into his hands and 12 lives hanging in the balance. The same mathematics, the same impossible choice between his principles and the lives of innocent people. But this time was different. This time he understood something he hadn't understood then. "Yes," he said quietly, "I can make the shot, but give me 1 more minute." Marcus set down his binoculars and picked up the radio handset, switching to the frequency the negotiation team had been using to try to reach Kevin. "Kevin Walsh, this is Marcus Rivera. I'm a medic with Phoenix General Hospital. I was there when they brought in the people who were hurt at your school. Can you hear me?" The desert fell silent except for the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see Kevin's head turn slightly, indicating he was listening. "Kevin, I know you're scared. I know you feel trapped. I've been where you are, not exactly, but close enough. I've been in a place where it felt like the only choices left were terrible ones." Marcus paused, watching the boy's posture through his scope. Kevin had lowered his rifle slightly, no longer aiming directly at the family but still tracking them. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, Kevin. I was a medic. My job was to save lives, to help people. But one day, I had to make a choice between my principles and my brother's. I had to become something I never wanted to be in order to save the people I cared about." Through his earpiece, Marcus could hear Commander Webb's voice. "What are you doing, Rivera?" Marcus ignored her, continuing to speak into the radio. "Kevin, I see you up there, and I know you're not a killer. I know you're a scared kid who made some terrible choices, and now you don't see a way out. But there is a way out. There's always a way out." The boy had stopped moving entirely now, his attention focused on Marcus's voice. "I spent 2 years hating myself for what I did in Afghanistan. I thought it made me a monster, thought it meant I was broken beyond repair, but I learned something, Kevin. Sometimes good people have to do terrible things. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent people is to make choices that go against everything you believe about yourself." Marcus could see the family in the valley below, still moving slowly towards safety, unaware that their lives hung in the balance of this conversation. "But you know what else I learned? Those choices don't define us unless we let them. What defines us is what we do afterward, how we try to balance the scales, how we try to save more lives than we've taken." Kevin lowered his rifle completely, resting it across his knees. "Kevin, you can end this right now. You can choose to be the person who saved those people down there instead of the person who hurt them. You can choose to be someone who made a mistake and then made it right." The silence stretched for long minutes. Then Kevin Walsh stood up in his position, set his rifle on the ground and raised his hands above his head. "I give up," his young voice crackled through the radio. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same support group circle at the Phoenix Veterans Community Center, but everything felt different. The faces around him were familiar now. David Torres with his quiet strength, Sarah the former MP with her practical wisdom, the young Navy veteran who still struggled with nightmares but was making progress. "How are you feeling about the commendation ceremony?" David asked. "That's a big deal, getting recognized by the mayor and the police department." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his folding chair. The ceremony was scheduled for next week, an official recognition of his role in peacefully resolving the Kevin Walsh situation. The media had called him a hero, the same word that had always made him uncomfortable. "I still don't know about the hero thing," Marcus said. "I just did what needed to be done." "Maybe that's what makes someone a hero," suggested Sarah. "Doing what needs to be done when nobody else can do it." The group had heard the full story over the past months, how Marcus had talked Kevin down from the ledge, literally and figuratively, using his own experience to reach a troubled teenager before violence could escalate further. Kevin was now in a juvenile facility, receiving therapy and education, his case becoming a model for intervention rather than pure punishment. "Any word on how the kid's doing?" asked David. Marcus nodded. "I visit him once a month. Court-approved mentorship program. He's doing better. Still has a long way to go, but he's working through his issues. Turns out he was being bullied pretty severely, felt completely powerless. The shooting was his way of trying to feel like he had control over something." "And Officer Morrison?" "Back on duty, but he requested a transfer out of SWAT. He's working with the Community Policing Division now, doing school outreach programs." Marcus smiled slightly. He says what happened that day changed his perspective on when violence is necessary and when it isn't. The session continued for another hour, touching on the usual topics: sleep patterns, anxiety management, finding purpose in civilian life. But for Marcus, these conversations felt different now, less like therapy and more like maintenance, the way a mechanic might fine-tune an engine that was running well but needed regular attention. After the meeting, Marcus walked out into the Phoenix evening with Jake Martinez, who had become a regular attendee after witnessing Marcus's transformation. "You seem different, hermano," Jake observed as they approached their vehicles. "More settled, I guess." Marcus considered this. "I think I finally figured out what Mr. Brennan meant that day in the ER, the difference between doing a job and answering a calling." "Yeah, what's the difference?" Marcus looked up at the desert sky where the first stars were beginning to appear above the city lights. "A job is something you do for pay, for security, for all the practical reasons. A calling is something you do because not doing it would make you less than who you're supposed to be." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of Phoenix settling into night, traffic on distant highways, the hum of air conditioners, the occasional siren marking another crisis somewhere in the city. "You know what the funny thing is?" Marcus said. "I spent 2 years thinking that day in Afghanistan broke something in me, made me into something I didn't want to be. But maybe it didn't break me. Maybe it just showed me who I really was." "And who's that?" Marcus thought about Kevin Walsh sitting in juvenile detention but working toward a better future. He thought about Officer Morrison, finding new ways to serve his community. He thought about Elena, the domestic violence victim who had called him last month to thank him and tell him she'd left her abuser and was starting over. "Someone who does what needs to be done," Marcus said finally. "Someone who saves lives, whatever that takes." As he drove home through the familiar streets of Phoenix, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before his deployment, a sense of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The desert stretched around the city like a protective barrier, harsh but beautiful, unforgiving but honest. His apartment felt different too, no longer like a temporary shelter, but like a home. On his kitchen table sat a letter from the Veterans Administration, offering him a position as a counselor specializing in combat trauma. On his bathroom mirror hung a photo from the support group, 12 faces, all different, all connected by invisible threads of shared experience and mutual support. Marcus Rivera, former Army medic, former sniper, current paramedic, and future counselor, looked at himself in that mirror and saw someone he could finally live with. Someone who had learned that heroism wasn't about being perfect. It was about making imperfect choices in impossible situations and then living with the consequences while trying to do better. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were different now. Instead of ending with the crack of a rifle and the weight of taking a life, they ended with a 17-year-old boy laying down his weapon and choosing to live. Outside his window, Phoenix slept under the desert stars, and Marcus Rivera was finally truly home.